Gerald Thompson stood behind the bar of his upscale restaurant, the Golden Spoon, surveying the dining room with a mixture of pride and disdain. The restaurant buzzed with the chatter of well-heeled patrons, clinking glasses, and the soft strains of jazz playing in the background. The aroma of Cajun-spiced dishes wafted through the air, a testament to Gerald's culinary expertise and his ability to blend New Orleans traditions with haute cuisine. As he polished a wine glass, Gerald's eyes narrowed at the sight of a black man entering the restaurant. The man, dressed in worn jeans and a faded jacket, looked out of place among the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses. Gerald's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the delicate stem of the glass. "Watch that one," he muttered to his maitre d', nodding towards the newcomer. "Make sure he can pay before you seat him." The maitre d' nodded, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before he composed himself and approached the man. Marcus Johnson hesitated at the entrance of the Golden Spoon, his eyes taking in the opulent decor and the well-dressed diners. He felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment in their eyes as they took in his appearance. His stomach growled, reminding him why he was here. After weeks of bland hospital food and instant meals, he craved something with real flavor, something to remind him of the vibrant city he called home. Taking a deep breath, Marcus straightened his shoulders and approached the maitre d'. "Table for one, please," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety churning in his gut. The maitre d' eyed him warily. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" Marcus shook his head. "No, I don't." "Is that a problem?" "I'm afraid we're quite busy tonight," the maitre d' replied, despite several empty tables visible in the dining room. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down the street." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, recognizing the thinly veiled dismissal for what it was. "I can see several empty tables from here," he pointed out. "I'm a paying customer, and I'd like to be seated." The maitre d' hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at Gerald, who was watching the exchange with a scowl. After a moment, he reluctantly led Marcus to a table near the kitchen, far from the other diners. As Marcus settled into his seat, he could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him. Whispers and sidelong glances followed him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to focus on the menu, but the words blurred before his eyes as he fought to maintain his composure. A waiter approached, his demeanor cool and detached. "What can I get for you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus ordered a glass of water and the special of the day, determined to enjoy his meal despite the hostile atmosphere. As he waited for his food, he couldn't help but overhear the conversations around him. "Can you believe they let him in?" A woman at a nearby table whispered to her companion. "This place used to have standards. Probably can't even afford the bread," another diner sneered. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, years of military discipline keeping him from responding to the barbs. He'd faced worse on the battlefield, he reminded himself. He could handle a few ignorant civilians. When his food arrived, Marcus was relieved to have something to focus on other than the hostile stares. He had just taken his first bite when a shadow fell across his table. Looking up, he found himself face to face with Gerald Thompson. "Is there a problem here?" Gerald asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Marcus swallowed his mouthful of food. "No problem at all," he replied evenly. "The food is excellent." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed out of place. Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable elsewhere?" The implication was clear. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice calm as he responded. "I'm perfectly comfortable here, thank you. I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else." Gerald's facade of politeness slipped. "Listen," he hissed, leaning in close. "I don't know how you got in here, but I want you out. Your kind isn't welcome in my establishment." The restaurant fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation unfolding before them. Marcus stood slowly, his height and military bearing making Gerald take a step back. My kind? Marcus repeated, his voice low and dangerous. And what kind would that be? Veterans? Heroes who've sacrificed for this country? Or are you just talking about the color of my skin? Gerald's face flushed red. I don't care who you are or what you've done. This is my restaurant, and I have the right to refuse service to anyone I choose. Based on what? Marcus challenged. My appearance? My race? That's discrimination, plain and simple. Get out! Gerald shouted, his composure finally cracking. Get out of my restaurant before I call the police. Marcus looked around at the other diners, seeing a mix of shock, embarrassment, and in some cases, smug satisfaction on their faces. He realized that no one was going to stand up for him. No one was going to challenge Gerald's blatant racism. With as much dignity as he could muster, Marcus picked up his jacket. I hope you're proud of yourself, he said to Gerald. I've faced enemy fire and watched good men die for the freedoms you enjoy. And this is how you repay that sacrifice. He walked towards the exit, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silent restaurant. As he reached the door, he turned back to face the stunned crowd. I may not be welcome here, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, but at least I can look at myself in the mirror and be proud of who I am. Can all of you say the same? With that, Marcus pushed open the door and stepped out into the New Orleans night, leaving behind a restaurant full of shell-shocked patrons and one furious owner. As the door swung shut behind Marcus, the spell of silence broke. The restaurant erupted into a cacophony of voices, some defending Gerald's actions, others expressing shock and disgust. Gerald himself stood rooted to the spot, his face a mottled red, fists clenched at his sides as he watched Marcus's retreating figure through the window. In that moment, neither man realized how this confrontation would change their lives, setting in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of their community and force them to confront the deep-seated prejudices that had long simmered beneath the surface of their city. As Marcus stepped out onto the sidewalk, the humid New Orleans air hit him like a wall. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline from the confrontation began to ebb. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. Marcus! Hey, Marcus! A familiar voice called out. He turned to see a group of his friends approaching, their faces etched with concern. Among them was his longtime friend and fellow veteran, Tony. Tony reached him first, clasping his shoulder. We saw what happened through the window. You okay, man? Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. I'm fine. Just another day in paradise, right? His attempt at humor fell flat, the bitterness in his voice unmistakable. The group surrounded him, offering words of support and outrage at Gerald's behavior. Their presence was comforting, a reminder that not everyone shared the restaurateur's prejudiced views. We should go back in there and give that guy a piece of our minds, one of the younger men in the group suggested, his fists clenched. Marcus shook his head. No, that's not the way. We can't fight hate with more hate. As the group discussed what to do next, none of them noticed the woman watching from inside the restaurant, her expression a mixture of shame and concern. Laura Thompson stood by the bar, her eyes fixed on the group outside. She'd witnessed the entire confrontation between her husband and Marcus, and the sick feeling in her stomach hadn't subsided. Gerald, what have you done? She murmured, watching as her husband stormed around the restaurant, loudly justifying his actions to anyone who would listen. Did you see how he was dressed? Gerald was saying to a pair of regular customers. This is a high-class establishment. We have standards to maintain. Laura approached him, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Gerald, can I speak with you for a moment? In private. Gerald turned, his face still flushed with anger. Not now, Laura. I'm dealing with a situation here. Yes, now, Laura insisted, her voice low but firm. She took his arm and led him towards the back office, ignoring his protests. Once inside, she closed the door and turned to face her husband. What were you thinking? She demanded. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? Gerald loosened his tie, exasperation clear on his face. I was thinking about protecting our business, our reputation. You saw him, Laura. He didn't belong here." "Didn't belong?" Laura repeated, her voice rising. "Based on what, Gerald? The color of his skin? His clothes? Did you even bother to ask who he was before you humiliated him in front of everyone?" "I don't need to ask," Gerald snapped. "I've been in this business for 20 years. I know trouble when I see it." Laura shook her head, disappointment etched on her face. "No, Gerald. What I saw out there wasn't you protecting our business. It was prejudice, plain and simple." Gerald's face hardened. "Don't be naive, Laura. You know as well as I do that certain people drive away our regular customers. I was just nipping a problem in the bud." "The only problem I see here is your attitude," Laura retorted. "That man was a paying customer, and you treated him like dirt. How is that good for business?" Gerald turned away, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from the decanter on his desk. "You wouldn't understand. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions to stay on top in this city." Laura watched him, a sadness settling over her. "I understand more than you think, Gerald. I understand that the man I married wouldn't have acted like this. What happened to you?" Gerald took a long swig of his drink, avoiding her gaze. "Nothing happened to me. The world changed, Laura. We have to adapt to survive. If adapting means becoming a bigot, then maybe we shouldn't survive," Laura said quietly. She moved towards the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "I'm going home. I can't be here right now." As she left, Gerald called after her, "Laura, wait!" But she was already gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the faint sounds of the restaurant beyond the office door. Laura made her way through the dining room, avoiding eye contact with the customers who were still buzzing about the incident. As she stepped outside, she saw Marcus and his friends still gathered on the sidewalk. For a moment, she considered approaching them, apologizing for her husband's behavior. But what could she say? How could she possibly make this right? With a heavy heart, she hailed a taxi and climbed in, giving the driver their home address. As the car pulled away from the curb, she caught a final glimpse of Marcus in the rear-view mirror. The image of his dignified bearing in the face of such blatant discrimination would haunt her for days to come. Back at their upscale home in the Garden District, Laura paced the living room, replaying the evening's events in her mind. She'd always known Gerald could be stubborn and set in his ways, but she'd never seen this ugly side of him before. Or had she simply been willfully blind to it? When Gerald finally arrived home hours later, the tension between them was palpable. He found her sitting in the darkened living room, a glass of untouched wine on the table beside her. "Laura," he began, his voice weary, "can we talk about this?" She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm not sure there's anything left to say, Gerald. I saw a side of you tonight that I never wanted to believe existed." Gerald sat heavily in the armchair across from her. "You're overreacting. What I did tonight was about business, not race." "Do you really believe that?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because from where I was standing, it looked an awful lot like racism." Gerald flinched at the word. "I'm not a racist," he insisted. "I have black employees, for God's sake." "Having black employees doesn't mean you're not prejudiced, Gerald," Laura countered. "It's about how you treat people, how you see them. And tonight, you didn't see that man as a person. You saw him as a threat, based on nothing but his appearance." Gerald opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "I was just trying to protect what we've built," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Laura leaned forward, her gaze intense. "What we've built. Gerald, if this is what our success is built on, then I want no part of it. We need to take a long, hard look at ourselves and decide what kind of people we want to be." As the night wore on, their conversation continued, sometimes heated, sometimes painfully honest. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same for Gerald and Laura Thompson. The next morning, New Orleans woke to a social media firestorm. A video of Gerald Thompson expelling Marcus Johnson from the Golden Spoon had gone viral overnight. Filmed discreetly by a patron, the clip captured the entire confrontation, from Gerald's initial approach to Marcus's dignified exit. Within hours, the hashtag Boycott Golden Spoon was trending locally, with outraged citizens sharing their own experiences of discrimination and calling for action against the restaurant. Local news outlets picked up the story, running it as their lead on morning shows and websites. Marcus Johnson, still reeling from the previous night's events, woke to find his phone inundated with messages and notifications. Friends, family, and even strangers were reaching out to offer support and express their outrage at his treatment. As he scrolled through the messages, a knock at his door caught his attention. Opening it, he found himself face to face with his son, David Johnson, a tall, imposing figure in his Army colonel's uniform. "Dad," David said, his voice thick with emotion as he embraced his father. "I just got back and heard what happened. Are you okay?" Marcus stepped back, ushering his son into the modest apartment. "I'm fine, son. It's good to see you. When did you get back from your deployment?" "Late last night," David replied, his eyes scanning his father's face for signs of distress. "I was going to surprise you this morning, but then I saw the news. Dad, why didn't you call me?" Marcus sighed, sinking into his worn armchair. "It all happened so fast, and honestly, I didn't want to burden you with it. You've got enough on your plate." David shook his head, taking a seat across from his father. "You're never a burden, Dad. What that man did to you, it's unacceptable. We need to do something about it." As they discussed the incident, David's military training kicked in. He began to strategize, thinking about how to turn this personal affront into a catalyst for change. "We need to mobilize," David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with his troops. "This isn't just about you, Dad. It's about every person of color who's been made to feel unwelcome or inferior. We have an opportunity here to make a real statement." Marcus listened, a mix of pride and concern on his face. "What are you thinking, son?" "A protest," David replied, his eyes glinting with determination. "Not just any protest, but one that highlights the contributions of veterans of color. We'll show Gerald Thompson and anyone else who thinks like him that we're not just part of this community. We've bled for it." As David outlined his plan, Marcus felt a surge of energy he hadn't experienced in years. His son's passion was infectious, reminding him of his own younger days when he believed he could change the world. "We'll need to be careful," Marcus cautioned. "We don't want this to turn violent or give anyone an excuse to dismiss us." David nodded, already typing out messages on his phone. "Absolutely. This will be a peaceful demonstration. We'll show them our strength through our dignity and unity." As the day progressed, David's plan began to take shape. He reached out to his network of fellow veterans, many of whom had already seen the video and were eager to support Marcus. They began organizing a peaceful protest to be held outside the Golden Spoon, scheduled for the following evening. Meanwhile, across town, Gerald Thompson was facing the consequences of his actions. The Golden Spoon's phone was ringing off the hook with cancellations and angry callers. The restaurant's social media pages were flooded with negative reviews and comments, many from people who had never even dined there. Gerald paced in his office, alternating between fury and panic. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, watching as another one-star review popped up on his computer screen. "They're trying to destroy everything I've built over one misunderstanding." His assistant knocked tentatively on the door. "Mr. Thompson, there's a reporter from the Times-Picayune on line 1. They're asking for a statement about last night's incident." Gerald waved her off. "Tell them no comment, and get our lawyer on the phone. We need to figure out how to shut this down." As Gerald grappled with the growing crisis, Laura Thompson sat in their home, watching the story unfold on the local news. Her heart sank as she saw interviews with people on the street, many of whom were calling for the Golden Spoon to be shut down. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number. "Hello? Yes, this is Laura Thompson. I'd like to speak with someone about last night's incident at the Golden Spoon. No, I'm not calling to defend what happened. I want to know how I can help make this right." As the day wore on, the story continued to gain traction. Local civil rights organizations issued statements condemning Gerald's actions and calling for a broader examination of discrimination in the city's hospitality industry. By evening, what had started as a personal confrontation had ballooned into a citywide conversation about race, privilege, and the lingering specter of discrimination in a city that prided itself on its diversity. As Marcus and David finalized their plans for the protest, neither of them could have anticipated the scale of what was to come. The incident at the Golden Spoon had struck a nerve, tapping into long-simmering tensions and resentments. In the coming days, New Orleans would find itself at the center of a storm that would force its citizens to confront uncomfortable truths about their city and themselves. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the bonds of family, friendship, and community, challenging everyone involved to examine their beliefs and decide what kind of future they wanted for their city. The following evening, a diverse crowd gathered in front of the Golden Spoon. Marcus and David stood at the forefront, surrounded by fellow veterans of various ages and backgrounds. Many wore parts of their military uniforms, medals glinting in the fading sunlight. They carried signs with messages like, "Veterans Against Discrimination," and "We fought for your freedom, not your prejudice." As the protest began, Marcus stepped forward to address the crowd and the news cameras that had assembled. "We're here today not just because of what happened to me," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "We're here because what happened to me happens to people of color in this city every day. We serve our country, we build our communities, and yet we're still treated as second-class citizens by some." David stood beside his father, his presence a silent support. As Marcus spoke, David scanned the crowd, noting the mix of anger and hope on the faces before him. He saw people from all walks of life, not just veterans and their families, but students, professionals, and longtime residents of New Orleans. Inside the Golden Spoon, Gerald Thompson watched the growing crowd with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The restaurant was nearly empty, save for a few loyal regulars who had braved the protest to show their support. "This is insanity," Gerald muttered, pacing behind the bar. "They're going to run us out of business over one misunderstanding." His maitre d', James, watched him nervously. "Sir, maybe we should consider making a statement. An apology, perhaps." Gerald whirled on him. "An apology? For what? For maintaining the standards of my restaurant? No, we're going to ride this out. They'll get bored and move on to the next outrage soon enough." As Gerald stubbornly refused to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, across town, Laura Thompson was making a decision that would change everything. She sat in her car outside the offices of the local NAACP chapter, gathering her courage. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped out, walking purposefully towards the entrance. Inside, she was greeted by Evelyn Brooks, the chapter president. "Mrs. Thompson," Evelyn said, her tone cautious but not unkind. "I must admit I was surprised to get your call." Laura nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm sure you were. I wanted to talk about what happened at my husband's restaurant. What he did was wrong, and I can't stand by silently anymore." As Laura began to open up about her concerns and her desire to make amends, back at the protest, the energy was building. David had taken the megaphone, his commanding presence drawing all eyes to him. "My father taught me that service to our country doesn't end when we take off the uniform," David declared. "It's a lifelong commitment to the ideals of equality and justice that we fought to protect. What happened at the Golden Spoon isn't just an insult to my father. It's an insult to every person who has ever put on a uniform to defend this nation." The crowd cheered, their voices echoing down the street. Among them, Tony, Marcus's friend from the night of the incident, nodded in agreement. "That's right," he called out. "We didn't fight for some Americans, we fought for all Americans." As the protest continued, it began to draw more attention. Passers-by stopped to listen, some joining in, others watching from a distance. The local news crews captured it all, broadcasting live updates throughout the evening. Inside the Golden Spoon, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Gerald's few remaining customers were visibly uncomfortable, glancing nervously at the windows as the chants from outside grew louder. One of the regulars, an older man named Frank, approached Gerald at the bar. "Listen, Gerald," he said, his voice low. "I've been coming here for years, and you know I've always supported you. But this doesn't look good. Maybe it's time to reconsider your position." Gerald's face hardened. "Not you too, Frank. I thought you of all people would understand." Frank shook his head sadly. "I understand wanting to protect what you've built. But at what cost, Gerald? Is it worth destroying everything over one man's meal?" As Frank's words hung in the air, Gerald's phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "We need to talk. What you did was wrong and I can't support it. I'm meeting with the NAACP to discuss how we can make this right." Gerald stared at the message in disbelief, a cold feeling of dread settling in his stomach. For the first time since the incident began, he felt truly alone. Outside, as the sun began to set, Marcus and David brought the protest to a close with a final, powerful statement. "We're not here to destroy anyone's business," Marcus said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We're here to build a community where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. We're asking the Golden Spoon, and every business in New Orleans, to look into their hearts and ask themselves, are you serving your whole community or just a select few?" As the crowd began to disperse, many lingered, forming small groups to discuss what they'd heard and seen. The energy of the event had ignited something in them, a desire for change, a hope for a better future. David put his arm around his father's shoulders. "You did good, Dad," he said softly. "This is just the beginning." Marcus nodded, looking out over the dispersing crowd. "I hope so, son. I hope so." As night fell over New Orleans, the city buzzed with conversations about what had transpired. In homes, bars, and cafes, people debated the issues raised by the protest. The incident at the Golden Spoon had become more than just a local news story. It had become a catalyst for a larger discussion about race, equality, and the soul of the city itself. The lines had been drawn, the statements made. Now, as both sides retreated to consider their next moves, one thing was clear. The battle for the heart of New Orleans was just beginning. In the days following the protest, the atmosphere in New Orleans remained charged. The incident at the Golden Spoon had sparked a citywide debate about racial discrimination, particularly in the service industry. Local news channels ran special segments exploring the city's history of segregation and the ongoing struggles faced by people of color in the community. Marcus and David, buoyed by the success of their initial protest, decided to channel this energy into something more constructive. They began planning a community event that would honor veterans of color while also addressing the broader issues of discrimination and inequality. "We need to show the positive contributions we've made," Marcus explained to a group of fellow veterans gathered in his living room. "It's not enough to protest against injustice. We need to celebrate our achievements too." David nodded, adding, "And we need to make it inclusive. This isn't just about us as veterans, it's about our entire community coming together." As they brainstormed ideas, the group settled on organizing a Unity and Service Festival. The event would feature booths highlighting the contributions of veterans from various backgrounds, as well as workshops on civil rights and community engagement. Meanwhile, across town, Gerald Thompson was facing the consequences of his actions. The Golden Spoon's business had plummeted, with many regular customers staying away due to the controversy. Gerald sat in his empty restaurant, staring at the financial reports spread out before him. "We can't go on like this," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. Just then, Laura walked in, her face set in a determined expression. "Gerald, we need to talk." He looked up, surprise and a hint of hope in his eyes. "Laura, I thought you were staying with your sister." She sat down across from him, her posture rigid. "I've been doing a lot of thinking and I've been talking to people you wouldn't normally listen to." Gerald's expression hardened. "You mean those protesters? Laura, you don't understand." "No, Gerald," she cut him off firmly. "It's you who doesn't understand. What you did was wrong. Not just morally wrong, but legally wrong too. The NAACP is considering filing a discrimination lawsuit against us." The color drained from Gerald's face. "A lawsuit? But I was just protecting our business." Laura shook her head, her voice softening slightly. "Were you? Or were you just acting on prejudices you've never bothered to examine? Gerald, we have a choice to make. We can either double down and lose everything, or we can admit we were wrong and try to make amends." As Gerald struggled to process this, Laura continued, "There's an event being planned, a Unity and Service Festival. I think we should offer to cater it, for free." Gerald's jaw dropped. "Cater it? For those people who've been trying to ruin us?" "Those people," Laura said firmly, "are our community, and it's time we started acting like we're part of it." Across the city, preparations for the festival were in full swing. Marcus and David had secured a large park for the venue, and were coordinating with various community organizations to set up booths and activities. As they worked, David noticed his father seemed preoccupied. "What's on your mind, Dad?" he asked during a break. Marcus sighed, looking out over the park. "I keep thinking about that night at the restaurant, about Gerald Thompson." David's expression darkened. "What about him?" "I'm wondering what made him the way he is," Marcus said slowly. "What experiences shaped his views, and if there's any hope for change." David looked skeptical. "After what he did to you? Dad, some people just don't want to change." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe. But if we don't believe change is possible, what are we fighting for?" As the day of the festival approached, excitement built throughout the community. Local businesses, eager to show their support, donated supplies and services. Volunteers signed up in droves to help with setup and coordination. The morning of the event dawned bright and clear. Marcus and David arrived early to oversee the final preparations. Booths were set up highlighting the contributions of veterans from various conflicts, from World War II to recent operations in the Middle East. Workshop tents were erected where discussions on civil rights, community engagement, and racial reconciliation would take place throughout the day. As the festival got underway, the park filled with people from all walks of life. Children laughed as they participated in games designed to teach cooperation and understanding. Adults moved from booth to booth, learning about the often overlooked contributions of veterans of color to American history. In one corner of the park, a group gathered for a workshop on confronting unconscious bias. The facilitator, a young sociology professor from Tulane University, led the group through exercises designed to expose and challenge ingrained prejudices. As the day progressed, the atmosphere was one of celebration and unity. The air was filled with the sounds of music, laughter, and earnest conversation. It seemed that, at least for this moment, the divisions that had rocked the city were beginning to heal. But as the festival reached its peak, a murmur ran through the crowd. People began pointing and whispering, their expressions a mix of surprise and wariness. Marcus and David, alerted by the change in mood, looked up to see what was causing the commotion. There, at the entrance to the park, stood Gerald and Laura Thompson. Gerald looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously around the crowd. Laura, on the other hand, stood tall, her chin raised defiantly as she guided her hesitant husband forward. As they approached Marcus and David, the crowd parted, a hush falling over the immediate area. The two couples stood face to face, the tension palpable in the air around them. Gerald cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mr. Johnson," he began, addressing Marcus directly for the first time since that fateful night at the restaurant. We... He faltered, looking to Laura for support. Laura stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "We're here to apologize," she said, "and to offer our support, if you'll have us." Marcus and David exchanged a look, years of unspoken communication passing between them in an instant. Then slowly Marcus extended his hand to Gerald. "Everyone's welcome here," he said simply. "That's the whole point." As Gerald hesitantly shook Marcus's hand, a ripple of applause spread through the watching crowd. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a small step towards the kind of community they were all there to build. The festival continued, its message of unity and understanding resonating even more strongly in light of this unexpected development. As the sun began to set over New Orleans, casting a warm glow over the park, there was a sense that something had shifted. A corner had been turned. The road ahead would not be easy. Old habits and prejudices don't disappear overnight. But as Marcus looked out over the diverse crowd, laughing and learning together, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible. It started here, with each individual choosing to reach out, to listen, to grow. In that moment, Marcus knew that their fight was far from over. But they had taken a crucial first step. And in New Orleans, a city known for its resilience and ability to come together in times of crisis, that was enough to build on. In the weeks following the Unity and Service Festival, New Orleans buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. The event had sparked countless conversations about race, equality, and community, and its effects rippled through the city's social fabric. For Gerald Thompson, the festival had been a turning point. The sight of so many people coming together, the stories he'd heard from veterans of color, and the unexpected warmth with which he'd been received despite his past actions, had shaken him to his core. He found himself questioning beliefs he'd held for decades, beliefs he'd never before thought to examine. One morning, as Gerald sat in his office at the Golden Spoon, staring at the still dismal financial reports, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he'd been given at the festival. "Hello, is this Marcus Johnson?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "It's Gerald Thompson. I was wondering if we could talk." Across town, Marcus was surprised by the call but agreed to meet. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small coffee shop in the French Quarter. As Gerald prepared for the meeting, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He turned to Laura, who had been his rock throughout this ordeal. "What if this is a mistake?" he asked. "What if I just make things worse?" Laura placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "The only mistake would be not trying," she said softly. "You're doing the right thing, Gerald." At the coffee shop, Marcus arrived first, choosing a table near the back where they could talk privately. When Gerald walked in, their eyes met, and for a moment both men hesitated, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Gerald approached the table, his usual confidence noticeably absent. "Mr. Johnson," he began, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Marcus nodded, gesturing for Gerald to sit. "I appreciate you reaching out," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. As they settled in with their coffees, an awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Gerald spoke, his voice low and strained. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the festival," he said, "about what happened at the restaurant, about the things I've believed all my life, and I've realized I've been wrong about a lot of things." Marcus listened quietly, his expression thoughtful as Gerald continued. "I don't expect forgiveness," Gerald said. "What I did to you was inexcusable. But I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I want to do better, to be better. And I was hoping maybe you could help me understand how." Marcus sat back, studying Gerald's face. He saw the genuine struggle there, the fear and uncertainty of a man whose worldview had been shattered. After a long moment, he spoke. "Change isn't easy," Marcus said, "and it doesn't happen overnight. But recognizing the need for change is the first step. I'm willing to talk, to share my experiences if you're truly willing to listen." Over the next hour, the two men talked. Marcus shared stories of his time in the military, of the discrimination he'd faced both in and out of uniform. He spoke of the daily microaggressions that wore away at a person's spirit, and of the larger, more overt acts of racism that had punctuated his life. Gerald listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in his life. As Marcus spoke, Gerald began to see the world through a different lens, to understand the impact of actions and attitudes he'd never before questioned. As their meeting drew to a close, Gerald felt both drained and oddly energized. "Thank you," he said to Marcus, his voice thick with emotion. "For your service, for your forgiveness, for everything." Marcus nodded, a small smile on his face. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The real work starts now." Inspired by his conversation with Marcus, Gerald decided to take action. He announced that he would be speaking at an upcoming community forum on racial reconciliation. The news spread quickly, and soon local media outlets were clamoring for interviews. As the day of the forum approached, Gerald found himself growing increasingly nervous. He paced in his living room, rehearsing his speech, while Laura watched with a mixture of pride and concern. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Gerald fretted. "What if they don't believe I've changed?" Laura stood, taking his hands in hers. "Just speak from your heart," she said. "That's all anyone can ask." The night of the forum arrived. The community center was packed, with people spilling out into the hallways. As Gerald took the stage, he saw Marcus and David in the audience, their presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. Gerald stepped up to the microphone, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded his prepared remarks. But as he looked out over the sea of faces, he set the paper aside. "I had a whole speech prepared," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "about how I've changed, about what I've learned. But the truth is, I'm still learning, every day. I'm here tonight not to tell you how much I've grown, but to ask for your help in continuing to grow." A hush fell over the room as Gerald continued, his voice growing stronger. "For too long, I've been part of the problem in this city. I've hidden behind tradition and the way things have always been done to justify my prejudices. But recent events have opened my eyes to the harm I've caused, not just to individuals, but to our entire community." As Gerald spoke, laying bare his faults and his hopes for redemption, the audience listened intently. Some nodded in approval, while others remained skeptical, arms crossed and brows furrowed. "I don't expect forgiveness," Gerald said, echoing his words to Marcus. "I haven't earned that yet. But I'm asking for a chance to do better, to be better. To work alongside all of you to build the kind of community we can all be proud of." As Gerald finished speaking, the room erupted in a mix of applause and murmured conversations. People turned to their neighbors, discussing what they'd heard, debating the sincerity of Gerald's words. In the midst of the commotion, Marcus made his way to the stage. As he approached Gerald, the room gradually fell silent, all eyes on the two men. Marcus extended his hand to Gerald, just as he had at the festival. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "And even more courage to commit to change. We're all on this journey together." As Gerald shook Marcus's hand, a tentative applause began, growing stronger as more people joined in. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was a start. A sign that maybe, just maybe, real change was possible. As the forum wound down and people began to file out, discussing what they'd heard, Gerald felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in weeks, he felt hope. Laura approached him, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Over her shoulder, Gerald caught Marcus's eye. The two men exchanged a nod of understanding. They both knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, not just for them, but for the entire city of New Orleans. The days following Gerald's speech at the community forum were filled with a mixture of hope and tension. While many praised his willingness to admit his faults and commit to change, others remained skeptical, viewing his words as little more than a public relations stunt to save his failing business. Marcus found himself at the center of this debate. As he walked down the street or picked up groceries at the local market, people would approach him, eager to share their opinions on Gerald's transformation. "You can't trust a leopard to change its spots," one elderly neighbor told him, shaking her head. "He's just trying to save face." Others were more optimistic. "It takes guts to stand up and admit you were wrong," a young man said to Marcus outside the Veterans Center. "We should give him a chance." Marcus listened to all these perspectives, carefully considering each one. He knew that his response to Gerald's efforts would be crucial in shaping the community's reaction. One afternoon, as Marcus was helping David organize another veterans support meeting, his son broached the subject. "Dad," David began, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about Thompson's speech. Do you really believe he's changed?" Marcus paused, considering his words carefully. "I believe he wants to change," he said slowly. "But wanting and doing are two different things. Real change takes time and effort." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So what do we do? How do we respond to his apology, I guess?" "We watch," Marcus replied. "We listen, and we give him opportunities to prove himself. But we also stay vigilant. We can't let our guard down completely." As they discussed the situation, an idea began to form. They decided to organize a town hall meeting, inviting Gerald to participate in a public dialogue about racial reconciliation and community healing. When they reached out to Gerald with the invitation, he was initially hesitant. "I don't know," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with anxiety. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if people think I'm just trying to save my business?" "That's a risk you'll have to take," Marcus replied firmly. "If you're serious about change, you need to be willing to face tough questions and criticism." After some consideration, Gerald agreed to participate. The night of the town hall arrived, and the community center was packed to capacity. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. On the stage, Marcus, David, and Gerald sat behind a long table, with a moderator from a local university positioned between them. As the moderator opened the floor for questions, a middle-aged woman stood up. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice sharp, "how can we trust that your change of heart is genuine and not just a ploy to save your restaurant?" Gerald took a deep breath before responding. "That's a fair question," he said, his voice slightly shaky. "The truth is, you can't know for certain. All I can do is continue to work on myself, to listen and learn, and to try to make amends through my actions. My restaurant, it's important to me, yes, but this is about more than that. It's about recognizing the harm I've caused and trying to be part of the solution instead of the problem." As the questions continued, some pointed and accusatory, others more supportive, Gerald did his best to answer honestly. He stumbled at times, occasionally looking to Marcus for support, but he didn't shy away from the difficult conversations. Halfway through the event, a young man stood up, his face etched with anger. "Mr. Johnson," he said, addressing Marcus, "how can you sit there next to the man who humiliated you? How can you forgive him so easily?" A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned to Marcus. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm as he responded. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he began, "and it's not something that happens overnight. What Mr. Thompson did was wrong, and it hurt not just me but our entire community. But if we don't allow for the possibility of change, if we don't create space for people to learn and grow, then we're stuck. We can't move forward." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "I haven't forgotten what happened, but I choose to focus on what can be, rather than what was. That's the only way we can build a better future for all of us." As Marcus finished speaking, a ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, while others still looked unconvinced. Gerald, visibly moved by Marcus's words, spoke up. "If I may," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to say that I don't deserve Mr. Johnson's graciousness. What I did was inexcusable, but his willingness to give me a chance to make amends, it's taught me more about strength and dignity than I've learned in my entire life." As the town hall continued, the atmosphere in the room gradually shifted. While skepticism remained, there was also a growing sense of possibility. People began to share their own experiences with prejudice and their hopes for a more inclusive community. By the end of the evening, no grand solutions had been reached, but a dialogue had been opened. As people filed out of the community center, there was a buzz of conversation, a sense that something important had begun. Marcus, David, and Gerald stood together near the exit, shaking hands and speaking with attendees as they left. The three men, once divided by a chasm of misunderstanding and prejudice, now stood united in their commitment to healing their community. As the last of the crowd trickled out, Gerald turned to Marcus and David. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me this chance. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to this journey." Marcus nodded, a small smile on his face. "We all have a long way to go," he said, "but tonight was a good start." As they parted ways, each man felt the weight of the work ahead. But they also felt a glimmer of hope. In a city known for its resilience and ability to come together in times of crisis, they had taken the first steps towards real, lasting change. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but tonight had shown that with open hearts and minds, even the deepest divides could begin to heal. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, a cautious optimism began to spread through New Orleans. The event had sparked numerous conversations and initiatives aimed at addressing racial inequality and promoting understanding across the community. Marcus and David found themselves at the forefront of these efforts, their experience and leadership sought after by various community groups and organizations. They were invited to speak at schools, churches, and local businesses, sharing their stories and insights on building a more inclusive society. One evening, after a particularly intense speaking engagement at a local high school, David approached his father with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," he began, "I've been thinking. We've made some progress, but there's still so much work to do. What if we organized a larger event? Something that could bring together people from all parts of the city?" Marcus nodded, considering the idea. "What did you have in mind?" "A citywide unity march," David replied, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "We could invite community leaders, local businesses, schools, everyone. It could be a visible demonstration of our commitment to change." Marcus smiled, pride evident in his expression. "That's a great idea, son. But organizing something like that won't be easy. We'll need help." As they discussed the logistics of such an event, Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. To his surprise, it was Gerald Thompson. "Marcus," Gerald's voice came through, sounding hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I wanted to talk to you about something important." Marcus exchanged a glance with David before responding. "Not at all, Gerald. What's on your mind?" Gerald took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the town hall, about my role in all of this, about what more I can do. I want to make a real difference, not just talk about it. I was wondering, would you be willing to meet with me? There's something I'd like to propose." Intrigued, Marcus agreed to meet Gerald the following day at a local coffee shop. When he arrived, he found Gerald already there, nervously fidgeting with a stack of papers in front of him. "Thank you for coming," Gerald said as Marcus sat down. "I've been working on something and I wanted to get your opinion before I move forward." He pushed the papers across the table. Marcus picked them up, his eyebrows rising as he read through the documents. "This is ambitious," Marcus said, looking up at Gerald. Gerald nodded, a mix of determination and uncertainty in his eyes. "I want to transform the Golden Spoon, not just the policies, but the entire concept. I want to turn it into a community space, a place where people from all backgrounds can come together, share meals, and have conversations. I'm thinking of renaming it the Common Table." As Marcus read through the proposal, he saw plans for hiring a diverse staff, implementing bias training for all employees, and creating a mentorship program for aspiring chefs from underserved communities. There were also ideas for community events, from cultural food nights to discussions on social issues. "This is impressive," Marcus said slowly. "But it's going to be a huge undertaking. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Gerald nodded, his expression serious. "I know it won't be easy, but I want to use my privilege and resources for good. I want the Golden Spoon, or rather the Common Table, to be a force for positive change in our community. But I can't do it alone. I was hoping you and David might consider being part of this, as advisors, or in whatever capacity you're comfortable with." Marcus sat back, considering the proposal. It was a bold move, one that could potentially have a significant impact on the community, but he also knew that such a transformation would face challenges and skepticism. "I appreciate you bringing this to me," Marcus said finally. "It's a powerful idea. But before I can give you an answer, I need to discuss this with David and others in the community. We need to make sure this is done right, that it's not just seen as a publicity stunt." Gerald nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I just want to do something meaningful, something that can help heal the wounds I've caused." As Marcus left the coffee shop, his mind was buzzing with possibilities. He couldn't help but feel a spark of hope at Gerald's proposal. It wasn't a solution to all their problems, but it could be a significant step in the right direction. Later that evening, Marcus shared Gerald's proposal with David. They spent hours discussing the potential benefits and challenges, weighing the risks and opportunities. "It's a big risk," David said, pacing the living room. "If it fails, it could set back a lot of the progress we've made." Marcus nodded, understanding his son's concerns. "True, but if it succeeds, it could be a model for other businesses. It could show that real systemic change is possible." As they debated the merits of the proposal, they both realized that this decision was bigger than just the two of them. It would affect the entire community, and their voices alone shouldn't be the deciding factor. "We need to bring this to the community," Marcus said finally. "Let's organize a meeting with local leaders, activists, and residents. We'll present Gerald's proposal and get their input. This needs to be a collective decision." David agreed, and they set about planning the meeting. As they worked, both men felt the weight of the moment. They stood at a crossroads, with the potential to shape the future of their community. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was filled with possibility. The community meeting to discuss Gerald's proposal for transforming the Golden Spoon into the Common Table was scheduled for the following week. Marcus and David worked tirelessly to ensure that a diverse group of community members would be present, reaching out to local leaders, activists, business owners, and residents from various neighborhoods. On the night of the meeting, the community center was packed. The air buzzed with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. Gerald sat at the front of the room, visibly nervous but determined. Marcus and David flanked him, their presence a silent show of support for the process, if not yet for the proposal itself. As Marcus called the meeting to order, he looked out over the crowd. He saw familiar faces from the protests and town hall meetings, as well as new ones drawn by the possibility of change. The diversity of the gathering was encouraging, a cross-section of New Orleans that spanned race, age, and socioeconomic backgrounds. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Marcus began. "We're here to discuss a proposal that could have a significant impact on our community. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a space for open and respectful dialogue. We're here to listen to each other and work together towards a better future for all of us." With that, he invited Gerald to present his proposal. Gerald stood, clearing his throat nervously before launching into his presentation. He outlined his vision for the Common Table, a space that would serve not just food, but as a catalyst for community engagement and social change. As Gerald spoke, the room remained silent, people listening intently. When he finished, Marcus opened the floor for questions and comments. The first to speak was Evelyn Brooks, the local NAACP chapter president. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice firm but not unkind, "your proposal sounds promising on paper. But how can we trust that this isn't just an attempt to salvage your business and your reputation?" Gerald nodded, acknowledging the validity of her concern. "That's a fair question, Ms. Brooks. I can't deny that I hope this will help restore the Golden Spoon's standing in the community. But this isn't just about saving a business. It's about creating something meaningful, something that can help heal the wounds I've caused and contribute to positive change in our city. I'm prepared to put my money where my mouth is, to invest in this transformation and to step back if the community feels someone else would be better suited to lead it." As the discussion continued, more people voiced their opinions. Some expressed excitement about the potential for a truly inclusive community space. Others raised concerns about gentrification and whether the transformed restaurant would truly be accessible to all members of the community. A young activist stood up, her voice passionate. "How can we ensure that this space will truly serve the needs of marginalized communities? Will there be programs to support local minority-owned businesses? Will there be opportunities for community members to have a say in the ongoing operations?" Gerald looked to Marcus and David, who nodded encouragingly. "These are all crucial points," Gerald responded. "To be honest, I don't have all the answers yet. That's why I'm here tonight. I want this to be a collaborative effort. I'm proposing the creation of a community advisory board that would have a real say in the operations and programming of the common table. I want this to be a space that's shaped by and for the community." As the meeting progressed, it became clear that while there was cautious support for the idea, there were also many details to be worked out. People wanted assurances about hiring practices, pricing, and the types of events and programs that would be offered. Towards the end of the meeting, David stood up to address the crowd. "I know many of you still have doubts, and those are valid. What my father and I have come to realize is that this proposal, whether it succeeds or fails, represents an opportunity for our community to come together, to have difficult conversations, and to work towards something positive. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to solve all our problems overnight, but it's a start." As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus called for a show of hands. "We're not making a final decision tonight," he explained, "but I'd like to get a sense of where we stand. How many of you would be interested in continuing to explore this idea, to work together to refine and potentially implement this proposal?" Slowly, hands began to rise. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a majority. There was a sense of cautious optimism in the room, a feeling that perhaps this could be the beginning of something meaningful. After the meeting, as people filed out of the community center, engaged in animated discussions about the proposal, Marcus, David, and Gerald stood together, taking in the energy of the moment. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said, looking at Gerald. "There's a lot of work ahead if you're serious about making this happen." Gerald nodded, a mix of exhaustion and determination on his face. "I know. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing something right, something that matters." David clapped a hand on Gerald's shoulder. "Remember, this isn't about you anymore. It's about the community. If we move forward with this, you need to be prepared to listen, to adapt, and sometimes to step back." "I understand," Gerald replied, "and I'm ready for that, whatever it takes to make this work." As they left the community center, the three men felt the weight of the task ahead. But they also felt a sense of purpose, a shared commitment to turning this proposal into a reality that could help heal and unite their community. The transformation of the Golden Spoon into the common table was far from certain, but the seed had been planted. In a city known for its resilience and ability to reinvent itself, this could be the start of a new chapter, one written together by all members of the community. In the weeks following the community meeting, the city of New Orleans buzzed with anticipation and debate over the proposed transformation of the Golden Spoon into the common table. The story had caught the attention of local media, with newspapers and TV stations running features on Gerald's journey from controversy to potential redemption. Marcus, David, and Gerald found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. They spent long hours meeting with community leaders, business experts, and potential partners to refine the proposal and address concerns raised during the initial meeting. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in Gerald's office reviewing the latest draft of the business plan, David's phone buzzed with a news alert. His face grew serious as he read the message. "What is it?" Marcus asked, noticing his son's expression. David looked up, his brow furrowed. "There's a group organizing a protest against the Common Table project. They're planning to gather outside the Golden Spoon tomorrow." Gerald's face paled. "A protest? But why? We've been trying to be as transparent and inclusive as possible." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Change is never easy, Gerald. There will always be those who resist it, who are skeptical of motives or afraid of what that change might mean for them." As they discussed how to respond to this development, Laura Thompson burst into the office, her face flushed with emotion. "Gerald," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "have you seen the news? They're digging into your family history." Gerald froze, a look of confusion on his face. "My family history? What do you mean?" Laura handed him her tablet, open to a local news website. The headline read, "Golden Spoon owner's father linked to segregationist past." As Gerald read the article, his face drained of color. The piece detailed how his father, the original owner of the Golden Spoon, had been a vocal opponent of desegregation in the 1960s, even going so far as to participate in protests against the Civil Rights Act. I had no idea," Gerald whispered, looking up at the others with shock in his eyes. "My father never talked about his past. I knew he was conservative, but this—" Marcus and David exchanged a glance, the weight of this revelation hanging heavy in the air. "This changes things," David said quietly. "People are going to question everything now. They'll wonder if your change of heart is genuine or if you've just been hiding your true beliefs all along." Gerald slumped in his chair, the weight of his family's hidden past crushing down on him. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stood up, pacing the room as he thought. "We face it head on," he said finally. "We can't hide from this. We need to address it openly and honestly." As they debated their next steps, the situation outside was escalating. Word of Gerald's family history had spread rapidly through social media, fueling the anger of those already skeptical of the Common Table project. By the next morning, a large crowd had gathered outside the Golden Spoon. Some carried signs supporting the transformation, believing in the possibility of change and redemption. Others held placards denouncing Gerald and calling for a complete boycott of the restaurant. As Marcus, David, and Gerald arrived at the scene, the atmosphere was tense. The police had set up barricades to keep the protesters separated, but the air crackled with the potential for conflict. Gerald stepped forward, his face a mask of determination despite the fear evident in his eyes. He approached the makeshift podium that had been set up, the crowd falling into an uneasy silence as he prepared to speak. "I know many of you have questions," Gerald began, his voice shaky but growing stronger as he continued. "You've heard about my father's past, a past I myself was unaware of until yesterday. I stand before you today not to make excuses, but to take responsibility." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My father's actions were wrong. His beliefs were wrong. And while I didn't know about his past, I have to acknowledge that I benefited from the privilege his actions helped to perpetuate. I can't change that history, but I can work to create a different future." As Gerald spoke, the crowd listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical, their arms crossed and brows furrowed. The Common Table Project isn't about erasing the past, Gerald continued. It's about acknowledging it, learning from it, and working together to build something better. I'm committed to this transformation, not just of a restaurant, but of myself and, hopefully, our community. He turned, gesturing to Marcus and David. I'm grateful for the guidance and support of men like Marcus and David Johnson, who have shown me what true strength and dignity look like. They've given me a chance to learn and grow, and I'm asking you all for that same chance. As Gerald finished speaking, a tense silence fell over the crowd. Then slowly a voice called out from the back. It was Evelyn Brooks, the NAACP chapter president. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice carrying across the gathering, your words sound sincere, but words are easy. What concrete actions are you prepared to take to show your commitment to change? Gerald nodded, acknowledging the challenge in her question. You're right, Ms. Brooks. Words aren't enough. That's why, effective immediately, I'm stepping down as the manager of the Golden Spoon. I'm turning over control of the restaurant and the Common Table Project to a community board, which I hope you and other community leaders will join. My role will be purely advisory, and only if the board wishes it. A murmur ran through the crowd at this announcement. It was a bold move, one that showed Gerald was willing to put the community's needs above his own interests. Marcus stepped forward then, addressing the crowd. Change is never easy, he said, his voice steady and clear. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it requires us to confront hard truths about ourselves and our history. But it's also necessary. What we have here is an opportunity to turn a symbol of division into a force for unity. He looked out over the sea of faces, seeing the mix of hope and skepticism reflected there. I can't promise you that this will be easy. I can't promise that we won't make mistakes along the way. But I can promise you this. If we work together, if we approach this with open hearts and minds, we have the chance to create something truly transformative. As Marcus finished speaking, a strange hush fell over the crowd. Then, slowly, a chant began to build. Common Table! Common Table! It wasn't everyone. There were still those who stood silent, skeptical, or angry. But the chant grew louder, a testament to the power of hope and the possibility of change. As the chant swelled, Marcus, David, and Gerald exchanged glances. They knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and challenging. There would be setbacks, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But in that moment, as the diverse crowd of New Orleans residents came together in a shared vision of a better future, they felt a spark of something powerful. It was more than hope. It was the first step towards real, lasting change. The story of the Golden Spoon's transformation into the Common Table was far from over. But as the sun set over New Orleans that evening, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd, it was clear that a new chapter had begun, not just for a restaurant, but for an entire community.